Hello, dear viewers. Namaskar. Welcome to Moksha Media. You are with Moksha Hiramat. Literary criticism is inevitable in literature. In order to make the literature a matured one, literary, literary criticism must be there. Without literary criticism, literature can't be advanced. If literary criticism is not developed in any particular language, that means literature is yet to be enhanced and yet to be matured. So, in the background of this, we have to see what is literary criticism. Literary criticism is a study of literary piece. It analyzes, it interprets, it compares, it extracts what is good in that literary piece, and at the same time it points out what the author should be done and should not be done. It bridges a gap between the author on one side and the readers on the another side, and of course the society on the other side. In order to do it, literary criticism must be there. Of course, at what time literary criticism is started is very difficult to be told. But it is believed that literary criticism is begun from the Plato, Plato and Aristotle, the Greek philosophers. It is believed that Plato told something about poetry in his book Republic. But of course, in that book, Plato gives, he deals with the negativity of the poetry. That he feels poetry is imitative, it spoils the feelings of the people. Sometimes it makes human being an erotic one, and etc. etc. But his disciple Aristotle did not believe it. What Plato told, he countered it in his book Poetics. Poetics is an important literary book in the history of literary criticism. Even today, that poetics is referred in so many cases. Aristotle does not believe what Plato tells. He says poetry is not mere imitation of something, it is not a copy of a copy, but it is a different. There, the poet uses his own approaches in his own way with a particular purpose. It might be imitated to a little extent. At the same time, the poet adds something to the meaning of that imitation. It is not simply taking a photo, but from what point, from what angle the photo is taken is very important. So, in that way, the poets are dealt with the matter with so many things. Therefore, Aristotle told that something about mimesis and catharsis. Mimesis deals with the imitation, and catharsis deals with the purgation. And by forgetting, it pushes the reader towards sublimity. And by forgetting the reader, it makes the reader a real human being. So, this mimesis and catharsis are very important in the literature. Of course, he told it in the, I think, 200 BC or roundabout. But anyhow, the point is literary criticism is important. So after that, we think of that literary theory and literary criticism. Some critic feel that literary theory and literary criticism are one and all, and others say that literary criticism is different from literary theory. But of course, the interpretation of these things depends upon the context, depends upon the period in which it is interpreted. Sometimes it is the literary theory which plays a prominent role. Sometimes it is literary criticism which plays a dominant place. Sometimes both of them are mixed together and try to understand that literary piece in the given context. So anyhow, from this point of view, we can trace 5 literary criticism periods in the history of literature. We can trace that classical and medieval literary period, Renaissance period, Enlightenment period, Romantic period, 19th century period, Neo-criticism period, and on. These periods identify the literary criticism and the literature and pieces of literature developed and brought out at that time. Of course, in the classical and medieval period, we identify that Plato and Aristotle. I have already told you something about the Plato and Aristotle. They played a prominent role in the development of literary criticism, especially Aristotle. That is why even today so many of us begin literary criticism from Aristotle's Poetics. As the time goes on and on, we come to the medieval period. In medieval period, Arabian literature plays a prominent role, especially the book Kitab I think. Says something about that literary criticism, but that is not that much of continued on and on as it is the classical Greek criticism. Then we come to the Renaissance period. Of course, Renaissance takes place. Renaissance took place in 1498 of Common Era. In Renaissance period, that literary criticism has developed to a new level. We have seen lot of people, lot of public who have shown interest in the reading of in the reading of literary pieces, especially dramas and essays, etc. etc. Of course, dramas were written in the form of poems at that time, in the form of poetry at that time. So, if you look at the Shakespearean dramas, we see almost all of them are in the form of poetry. That is why Shakespearean dramas become a poetry. At the same time, they become a, uh, at the same time they are poems also. So anyhow, Shakespeare and others carry the literature to a new height, as we see it in case of Sanskrit period. Of course, if we come to the language of Sanskrit, we have so many poets. For example, Kalidasa, who is surpassed sometime uh, Shakespeare in English language. Sometimes we identify Shakespeare with Kalidasa, but it is vice versa. So that Kalidasa has his own personality, has his own poetic things, and he developed, he composed poems, he composed dramas before Shakespeare. Of course, he has got his own place in the history of Sanskrit literature. We have Francis Bacon, who wrote essays. Of course, literary criticism can be written in the form of essays or in the form of articles, in the form of periodicals, etc. etc. Bacon's essays are very important, and especially in his essay, Advancement of Learning, I think, and something about the study, he says something about the literary criticism. Then we have the Enlightenment period, in which we see John Dryden, and of course it is the 17th and 18th century. John Dryden develops the metaphysical poetry, and he says something about that metaphysical poetry in his compositions, in his writings. Then we see Samuel Johnson, who is considered a great critic till this time. Of course, that Samuel Johnson gives a new approach to the literary criticism. He was well read. He approached literary pieces from different point of view, from different angles. He shows what is good and what is not that much of good in the literary pieces, and he tries to bridge the gap between the writer, that is the writer and poets on the one hand, and the readers on the other hand. And of course, his criticism is even today appreciated. Then there are so many persons. For example, a Pope, Pope, who criticized so many persons and who look at the pieces of literature from different angles. Then we have the Romantic period. In Romantic period, we have the poets like Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, etc. etc. Of course, especially Wordsworth, the preface to ballads, and S.T. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria are important for literary criticism, because for the first time the literature has come out of the palaces, it goes to the common people, and it says something about the importance of the nature, and it says what is there in the nature, and it portrays nature is the guide, friend, and philosopher. That is why it says we have to follow nature. If we follow nature, most of the problems of humanity will be solved. S.T. Coleridge also done the same thing in his book Biographia Literaria. He composed something about so many writers in that work, and he also gives importance to the nature, and he says nature is the part and parcel of a life. When we forget the nature, nature will forget us, and then there will be a apostrophe, or then there will be a danger, then there will be a problem. And if we follow the nature, those problems can be solved very easily. Of course, as the time goes on and on, we have new criticism, especially in the 19th, that is the first part of the 19th century, common era, 19th century of common era. So there we see the new criticism, and at the same time the Russian understanding of the criticism, especially in the 20th century. So many social theories are developed, and these social theories looked at the literary pieces from different angles. Here we can say something about S.T. Coleridge, Matthew Arnold, and I.A. Richards, etc., etc. And social theories are developed, such as Darwin's The Theory of Evolution, Sigmund Freud's The Behavior, that is the analytical psychology, Sigmund Freud and John Young's analytical psychology, Karl Marx, German ideology, and etc. etc. Then American linguists, that Ferdinand de Saussure's structuralistic understanding of the literary pieces, etc., etc., are developed. These theories, social theories, look at the literary pieces from different angles. German ideology of Karl Marx look at the literary pieces from the point of view of dialectical materialism. And it talks of class and classless society. If we want to go out of class to the classless society, then we have to abolish the private property system, etc., on and on. And of course, his friend Engels also said something about the literary criticism in his book, The Sacred Family, I think, Holy Family, I think. And what Marx told, he confirmed it in his works. Then we see Darwin's theory of evolution. He looks at the literary pieces from the evolutionary point of view. So literature is developed from lower stage to the higher stage. If a person approaches literary pieces from higher stages to lower stages, it is not that much of good. It is not real, it is not true, etc., etc. Then we see Sigmund Freud's analytical behavior in the literary pieces. He approaches literary pieces from the point of view of behaviors, from the point of view of feelings, behavioral feelings. And when he approached it from the behavioral analysis, automatically it gives a different outlook. So, like this, these social theories play a prominent role in literary criticism. And we have to mention that S.T. Coleridge and Matthew Arnold, who contributed a lot to literary criticism, especially S.T. Coleridge's on tradition and Matthew Arnold's and Thomas Carlyle, etc., who talked of heroes and hero worship, etc. Through these works, they said something about literary criticism. And as the time goes on and on, in 20th century, the literary criticism is developed. Critics like F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards have taken literary criticism to a new height. Ferdinand de Saussure, an American linguist and anthropologist, who said something about the structuralism in a language and literature, and all these social theories, all these literary critics have contributed in their own way to the literary criticism. But of course, India is not lagged behind. We have Natya Shastra composed by Bharatamuni and Rajashekara's comment of it. And in Kannada literature also, we have Kaviraja, Nrupatunga's Kaviraja Marga and Keshi Raja's Shabdamani Darpana. Nrupatunga's Kaviraja Marga and Keshi Raja's Shabdamani Darpana play a prominent role in the development of literary criticism in Kannada language. Of course, other critics, other literary figures also wrote something about literary criticism in Kannada literature, such as Kuvempu, Putina, and Adiga, Gopalakrishna Adiga, and of course Kirtinath Kurtukoti, Gireddy Govindaraj, and S.L. Bhairappa in some of his works. They have talked of literary criticism. They have shown the way of literary criticism in their own way in Kannada literary criticism. So while using literary criticism in Kannada literature, we have to go through these literary figures and critics. There are other critics, of course, they are also important, but for the time being, here I have mentioned some of them. So, like this, literary criticism should be developed. If literary criticism is not developed, to that extent, the growth of literature will be crumbled. So, to make literature a noble one, a sublime one, literary criticism should be used properly, and it should be looked at all the things, and a critic should be an intensive and extensive reader. He should be positive, and he should show us a new way. Such type of literary critics, we are in need of it nowadays. Of course, they are there, but their numbers should be increased in order to enable any literature in the world to make it proper and to enable the readers to make the readers a noble and sublime one. So, in this way, we have to use that literary criticism. Literary criticism doesn't mean simply attacking the writer or simply attacking the literary pieces. That is not a good literary critical taste. That is a negative approach. We have to show the negative things, no doubt about it, but at the same time, we have to extract what is there in that literary piece and what is there in that poet, writer, novelist, dramatist, essayist, etc., etc. So, in the strict sense, the literary criticism should be used, then only we can see the development and growth of literature in any language. Of course, Kannada literature is not an exception to this. So, this is the way we have to go. Dear viewers, subscribe and share it. See you in the next episode. Namaskar.